Hip politics, baby.
It's being recorded.
Yes. I'm gonna count us down. In 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to another episode of the Hip Politics Podcast. You got your boy, your host, Mr. Cameron Calvin, Cameron Trimble, aka Mr. Cameron Calvin, aka Mr. Hip Politics, aka 216 to the 202. Sitting minimum safe distance apart from me is my co-host, my co-pilot, Mr. Michael McQuarrie, aka DC Newt 90, aka the mayor of Capitol Hill. What's up, Mike?
What's up? Which ones was this?
We both cameras are on. We just talk. We talking to each other.
What's up? What up, folks?
And special guest today. I'm glad I got this guy. Yeah, we got this guy in the building. Veteran political reporter. Seems to just pop up a lot of random places, which I guess is the sign of a good reporter. Yeah, because he's always getting a scoop. He spent almost 6 years as the political reporter for Buzzfeed. I got to know him during my time on Capitol Hill, and then also he's a champion for a lot of other people in the journalism business, especially a lot of black people in the journalism and the communication space. He's your go-to person if you are trying to get something leaked and trying to get it exclusive. He's always trying to break a story, and we're gonna jump into that. I got my brother, Mr. Darren Sands here. What's up, Darren?
What's up? What's up? Good to be with y'all.
Yes, thank you, man.
For sure.
Thanks for braving the Corona world. Again, for people, we're practicing safe minimum distance of 6 feet. That's why it took a little longer to set this up. A little longer than normal to set this up because this is not our normal setup, and we're a little more farther away. But we're still in the room, still good conversation, and we wiped the mics down.
This is February, right? March.
This is March.
I'm trying to think what's in 9 months, because in 9 months it's gonna be, a population.
Oh, Corona babies?
Yeah,
Corona babies are coming.
Yeah.
It's just like there's the snowpocalypse babies. Like Corona babies are a full thing. Man, when you tap that thing, anyways. This is a free flowing podcast.
Yes. You can
Darren, man, thanks for coming in. Appreciate you. I know we've been texting about getting you in here today, and just kind of talking to our people in our platform. I think you are one of the epitomes of what this whole platform is around hip politics, like a person clearly in our generation, hip hop generation, but you're on the cutting edge of news, like working in the digital news space, but also very politically connected and kind of keeping us informed. And building stories and narratives. So I wanted to talk to you about two main things. One, just about the aspect of political reporting. Like, I think politics has now become pop culture in a way. There's more news channels, there's more digital news channels, there's more reports. Like it leads. You can go on Entertainment Tonight or E or something like that, the E channel, and they're reporting on politics. I think Trump had. Part of it is the media business has evolved and people's habits have evolved, but I think Trump juiced the system and like turned politics into like big reality show. So jumping right into yes.
Well, first, Darren, could you tell us like where you from, how you got started in this? Because I talk to you maybe once or twice a month and have no idea where you're from. But I mean, we talk on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And tell us how you got into doing what you're doing now.
Yeah. I always knew that I wanted to be a journalist or a reporter. I felt like that was just where my skill set was leading me to. Being young and reading newspapers with my dad, that was where the news was important in our household. It was news and sports, just being up on current events. That was just how my dad lived his life. He's still alive, but that was my entry in terms of just the news and this idea of power it always kind of intrigued me, and the stories that you get out of politics are great because you get all sorts of people from all sorts of places who are going after different things in terms of, you know, the reasons why they're getting involved. And so just people that we know are interesting. They're some of the most interesting people in our generation that do this work. And I feel fortunate to be able to tell their stories. I didn't really get into politics until 2014 when I wrote a story for the New York Times Magazine about Charlie Rangel and his last race for office. He was going up against a young pastor named Michael Warren, who's a pastor of First Corinthians Baptist Church in Harlem. Intriguing guy, young guy from the Northeast who went to Morehouse and just created a leadership lane for himself in the policy and religious space. And he was someone who a lot of people were paying attention to at that point in time. He challenged Rangel. And there was just an interesting story to me about just the intergenerational tensions that come when you have a very young person who's impatient and wanting to create change in his community. But then you also had someone like Charlie Rangel who is literally a war hero, you know, and a career
war hero.
Yeah. And comes back in the 70s, you know, runs for Adam Clayton Powell's seat, wins it, and becomes kind of a cult hero in Harlem and in the surrounding areas in New York City. Obviously, he rises, becomes one of the most powerful members of Congress before all of the ethics stuff, and then, you know, that cycle came back again. You had a young person challenging the older, more established individual. So that was where I kind of entered, and I just thought it was such a great story. And I never really turned back from wanting to tell those stories about the cycles and how things come back politically. And just for our generation in particular, the idea of pursuing political power doesn't look like it did back in those days. And so with the advent of the internet and just all of this stuff that I'm sort of native to culturally, I think I've created a lane for myself where I enjoy deeply what I do. It feels important, and you know, I'm happy to be doing it. I'm fulfilled almost every day doing this work, and obviously I'm honored to be here because I think that the intersection of what you guys are doing is like extremely important to the work that so many people are doing, whether it's on Capitol Hill or in these state houses around the country, or really anywhere. There's no space politically that people don't have or aren't tuned into the consciousness of the hip hop generation and the political consciousness of the generation that sees hip hop as the mainstream culture in America. And the reason why it's so important, I think, is because people realize that the culture itself is inclusive. There's no cancel cultures in hip hop. It's an open culture. It's a culture about sharing and opportunity and equality for everybody. So it's just extremely important, and you guys have been articulating that for a while. But it is really the reason why I think the three of us talk so much offline, just because we recognize its importance.
To that point, there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about in your explanation. Kind of going back initially, you said 2014. When did you graduate college, or get started reporting?
So I got started like 2006, 2007, transitioning out of college and into
school?
that. I went to Hofstra.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you went straight into reporting?
Yeah, I went like straight into. I worked at Newsday in Long Island. It's like the biggest newspaper, and then I was covering like high school sports. So I was covering like field hockey and
Lacrosse.
soccer. Lacrosse is a big one in Long Island. I grew up in Boston, but I was born and kind of raised in Long Island, New York, that area. So I was already very familiar with the towns and the makeup. And
Made it easy.
I mean, high school sports is interesting too because there's such a political aspect to just the way that like young people who are trying to get college scholarships and things like that.
The parents behind them. I'm pretty sure that has a lot. Yeah.
The newspapers and the story of what happens with these young people ends up becoming a real part of the opportunities that people get. So you understand the media's importance of telling.
Well, that's true.
Like
the more they get stories, the more other colleges and stuff see them, and so they're actually probably trying to curry favor to make sure they get mentioned and
absolutely.
stuff like that.
A quick example of that is when I was covering high school sports. Tobias Harris, who's a forward on the 76ers now. I guess this was 2009, 2008, somewhere in there, and he was a sophomore in school. Half Hollow Hills East, I want to say, when he was living out there at the time. He went to another high school, but there was like the semifinal of the state championship. He had an inbounds play, and there was a turnover, and it happened so fast. I just saw that he turned the ball over, but when I wrote about it, and the next day, I got angry phone calls from his pops and like people, coaches, and things like that because the way that the play unfolded, it went so fast that the only way that I could really describe it was to say that he was somewhat culpable. I don't know who took a step this way or that way, who messed up the play, but he had the ball on the inbounds play, and not to say that like affected him in his life or anything like that,
but just
like,
that little bit of being painted in a negative light in one story was like,
it's like
they thought that could be detrimental
at the time. I'm sure they did, but it just goes to show.
He went on. He signed a max contract for $180 million.
He's fine.
He's fine.
I got to see him a couple of times in DC when Philly played here, but that's just an example of how the story that gets told about these people is something that they have to worry about. And when in the pursuit of power and the things that we're talking about, a lot of times we end up telling a bigger story about leadership character in this moment. And people are looking. You talked about this added interest in politics. I think people are looking for what to do in our society and in our culture, and politicians, what they end up presenting can be really important because people are out here really trying to, I think, capture hearts and minds. So,
when you made that first story about Charlie Rangel, was that, if you said for New York Magazine, was that something you were doing on your own?
New York Times Magazine.
Or New York Times Magazine, not
New
York Times Magazine, distinction. Was that something they looked to you for, or you pitched the story?
I think I pitched it.
But you didn't work for New York Times?
No, I was freelancing at the time. And so I just had you have to always kind of have your fingers in the middle of kind of what's happening and where the stories are. Mm-hmm. And so that was just, almost kind of hitting the lottery in the sense of these stories are everywhere, but the way that you actually get people who have power to publish you interested is another story.
Yeah, that's kind of going into that and speaking to that as a whole. When people who watch this, and like I said, the idea behind the podcast and the whole platform is to kind of deconstruct like politics and deconstruct the politics of politics, social justice, and even of hip hop, because I feel like a lot of people see this stuff on TV or see it online, but they don't see the path. Like, there's no like roadmaps for a lot of these things. They just see, people who are already on TV are already online, their names are already in bylines, and they just got there. But when you go to journalism, one thing I was always, obviously I'm right back into media and comms, but I had never majored in it because what the number one thing that scared me away was, like, I heard they make zero money. And starting off reporters or people really early in the game, like, there's just not a lot of money, whether you're going to be on TV and try to be an anchor, reporter, correspondent, or you're writing in newsrooms, which when I came out were still viable, but now that whole thing has changed. Like, was that ever a discouragement on your initial path, and as you're going along, like, I'm doing this more because I love doing it and I'm good at it, and because there's a way to make money in every job in media eventually, but the path to it is a lot narrower and different in journalism. Did that ever discourage you? Because I think that I know it discouraged me at that point. I'm pretty sure it discourages a lot of people who might have a passion for writing or investigating and telling stories, but they also want, in college, most people dream of, like, I'm gonna be a millionaire by 30.
I remember those days.
But I'm curious, like, did it discourage you, or, like, how have you navigated the business of being a journalist throughout this time?
It's not like I haven't had difficulties this whole time, but I think part of what I've been fortunate in a lot of respects, and part of it is, like, I've had people whose careers I've wanted and, like, been able to, like, look at and I try to model a lot of what I do and the approaches that I take, and, like, just try to force the action. You know what I mean? Like, there's people that I really, really respect, writers who I love, and I'm not going to have all of their ideas, but I can hustle and grind and kind of just figure out where my lane is and just not deviate from it and just continue to push forward no matter how difficult it gets. Every journalist career has, like, starts and stops and weird places that you end up going, but if you know that this is what you want to do and you're committed to your craft and getting better, you're going to find the fulfillment that you are looking for, whether it's monetary or otherwise. But I never really let it deter me, and it's something that Stacey Abrams even talks a lot about in her book. It was called Minority Leader, but I think she changed it to Leading from the Outside, which is actually a smart choice. But what she talks about in that meeting or in that book, a lot about is just, like, what you feel like your purpose is. And for me, like, I always known that my purpose was to be able to tell the stories that are gonna get overlooked, but that are important, and tell them with sensitivity and nuance. One of the things that I always think about, not to belabor the point, but it's like reporters a lot of times, and we've all seen it in stories that are political in nature, people will be like, oh, black people are not a monolith, and they'll move on. It's like, what does that mean? You know what I'm saying?
I'm sure sometimes people who even hear that word are like, don't even understand the concept of, like,
Yeah. And so I try to talk about where black people in particular, where the similarities are and the differences are, or, politically, or between generations. That's why I talked about Wrangell and Walrond. Like, yeah, I get it. We're black people are not a monolith. But, like, how does that actually play out in politics? How does it play out in our culture? And what does it mean that we're different? That's all part of the Black American story too. So I try to do that a lot in the work that I do. I get it. Black people are not a monolith, but the ways that we are different and the ways that we are the same, it takes a certain synthesis, and it takes an ability or a willingness to analyze that stuff and to talk about topics that are sensitive, and not to shy away from it. I think that's the most important part. This would just be the type of reporter or writer that wants to deal with complicated subject matter. So that's what I try to do.
How did you being a black reporter, and especially how we know you through kind of congressional in this world, which is still very white dominated, even though there's a very strong, like, kind of as the CBC, I would say, if they're the core, the heartbeat of like black federal politics, and then all the tentacles and stuff that comes from there. So obviously, I feel like you've elevated past just being a black reporter who only reports on like black politics or the black political leaders, but you also do spend a significant amount of time, or at least through my perception, has spent a significant amount of time reporting in that space. Like, how have you been able to navigate not being just, because you're not it's one thing if you're working for Blavity or the Root or one of a black media outlet, but you've worked for just traditional mainstream media outlets, or non-black focused media outlets. How have you like transcended or got above just being pigeonholed as like, all right, here's a black story, let's send a black reporter, but then also, like you said, being sensitive and telling those nuance and those stories, the stories that mean something to you? Like, how have you kind of been able to float that line?
Yeah, that used to be a conversation or a conversation piece that a lot of us as reporters used to have, was like, well, if we're just going to do black stories, like, what does that mean about us? You know what I'm saying? From an identity standpoint. And I think from the time that I had been at Buzzfeed, beginning in 2014, through the 16 election, through the midterms in 18, I think we've all gotten more comfortable in so many ways with this subject matter, in the sense that we understand it to be central to understanding the American story in the time and place that we're in. Like, I don't see these stories as other. This country fought a civil war based on the idea that one part of the country wanted slavery and that the other part didn't, and there was a war over it. And war was not that long ago. You know what I mean?
In the grand scheme of things, I always tell people, like, when they're like, oh, could a woman be president? Could a gay person be president? I was like, first of all, they just gave women the right to vote 100 years ago. Black people just really got our rights back 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
The fact that if you think that we're past so many of these things, like, all this is within our grandparents still. If your grandparents connected to it, it's not that far away.
Yeah. Yeah. I was in Chicago in an Uber, and this is for All-Star Weekend, but I remember talking to someone. There's so many people with roots in Chicago whose families are from Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And the thing about that, Mississippi to Chicago story, there's so many layers to it. The big thing, obviously, is the Emmett Till story, from Chicago visiting Mississippi, and what happens to him ends up transforming America in so many different ways. But the idea that even today, so many of those people who live in Chicago, especially older people, have ties to sharecropping. They picked cotton themselves. They this one gentleman was telling me stories about people who tortured he and his family, and and back in Mississippi, and this idea that so many people were moving to Chicago, he couldn't at the time fathom the idea that you talk back to the police in Chicago. But that was the thing that his brother had told him. He's like, you can actually interface with the police as a dignified human being if you have some sort of the idea of a civil society where black people were equal was like a dramatic thing for him to think about when he was 19, 20, 21 years old. That doesn't leave you.
No, I feel you. My grandma, I come from a family just like that. It wasn't Mississippi, it was Arkansas and Alabama. My dad's side, my grandmother, who's still alive and kicking, 97, and coming from Alabama and her family, that same thing, like you said, there's that mass exodus of like that tie to the black experience. Yeah. And Chicago, I think, more than any one city, is so uniquely tied to the Southern black experience. Right. There. Yeah.
And in such a, in some ways, it's a beautiful thing to be able to bear witness to this story as a person who's living today. There's so many times I got to sit with Elijah Cummings, obviously God bless the dead, but one of the things that he used to talk to me about was this idea of where we are and talking about what the responsibilities are if you're living today and you're young. And he used to talk about his father watching him get inaugurated or sworn in, rather, as a member of Congress. And he sees he told me how, he's told this story a lot, but he was telling me just one-on-one about how he'd seen his father crying after the ceremony. He's like, Dad, why are you crying? And he said, when I saw you up there, I got to see what I could have been. And wow, that's deep. Yeah, and the thing about that is that there's really no differences between he and his father except the time that they were alive and like people in American society. And obviously Elijah Cummings went on to be one of the most legendary members of Congress that there have ever been, just by virtue of his character, right? Like he was obviously he was a great man, and he was extremely wise and all this other stuff. But at the core, he was an individual who came into his own time and place and was able to make a huge impact. But he was one of the first people of his family to be able to realize that kind of promise and that kind of have those kinds of accomplishments. So it's weird, and so I see what we're talking about as central to understanding our country. And if you are ignoring what happened to black people in this country in the past 200 years, then you don't know anything about what's going on. I mean, that's just like, to me, those are the rules. And I don't think that me focusing on any particular stories, I had an editor when I left Buzzfeed say, I got to thank you because I got to learn so much about how democratic politics works through you and figuring out those stories as we go along, covering Black Lives Matter, when people are in the streets and literally having to come up with the language to talk about what's going on, like that's the responsibility. And you just got to do it. Like there's no roadmap.
It's the responsibility is so big, especially for a person in a place where you were being at Buzzfeed during those type of years, because now the way the media business and culture affects it, the Buzzfeed was probably number one at like creating those cultural buzz moments where something that be a meme or headline can turn into like nomenclature in the country, and people are kind of that telephone effect. Well, I saw it on this and I saw it on that, and that's the most information people get. So ensuring you have the right language, the right texture and tone, context in a, especially on a platform that's not known for like longer pieces, I think was really crucial. So like there is a lot of responsibility there because of the disproportionate impact that the media as a whole, and then specifically some of the outlets that you've worked on can have. So yes, because sometimes you see that stuff and you're just like, man, they just doing that for clicks, or they're doing it like, is there any real substance there? But having to sprinkle that in. Did you have a question? Or
I've lived in a couple of cities: Jackson, Mississippi, Clarion Ledger, Detroit, Michigan, Detroit Free Press, Detroit News, and here in Washington D.C. Could you explain to us how this city is a little bit different when you're reporting news, doing news, as opposed to cities outside the Beltway? Is it a different style you have to use, or is it a different, your sources are different, or do you have to just write differently? Because when you're writing about most of the stuff that's inside the Beltway, is totally different from what's outside the Beltway. I just know those writing styles of those papers because I live in those cities, but it's totally different from the writing styles of the papers that are, the media that's here inside the Beltway.
It's a good question, and I think part of it is you have to understand that DC is like its own culture. It's a small city in terms of area, like area of just pure the streets. It's like Manhattan in a lot of ways. It's a congested place, and so you can walk the street in Manhattan for an hour and like see somebody like that's how when people are working in the middle of the week or something, like it's such a congested place. And that congestion is more of a social congestion in Washington, D.C., I feel like, in terms of just how you can't get out of the mix of broad, really important conversations about power and policy and where the country is without you can go anywhere and kind of have that conversation in DC. And it makes it fun in that respect. But it can also be, I think, a little bit disorienting.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, I think it's complicated. So there's, for me, how I tend to understand it is that in DC there are any number of really hugely impactful stories that can be bubbling and can explode at any time. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? So when the impeachment was going on, this thing was going on for like weeks and weeks and weeks, but you could feel the tension in the air, there's a gripping sort of like a gripping nature to the anticipation and the unknown, the uncertainty about what's going on. You know what I'm saying? Like what I was reading a lot about the Nixon impeachment, mm-hmm. and one of the things that I realized was that Nixon just resigns. Like they had done all of this planning,
for the impeachment. You mean? Yeah, like they were ready to basically do what we did. People tried to do to Trump, but he just said, "I'm out." That was going to be a Senate trial that resulted in removal. Like that was what they were working on. Like Barbara Jordan was, after her opening testimony, goes back. I think she was supposed to become one of the jurors in the Senate trial, and then it was over. Like that was it. Like there was no more nothing. Richard Nixon gets on the helicopter and goes away, and that's such a weird dynamic
because, and I think we're feeling a little bit of that now in terms of this coronavirus situation. Us now, we're speaking a little bit before this is going to air, obviously, but there's a sense of uncertainty about what's going to happen. And the types of press conferences that they're doing and all, we don't know if who's going to come down with this thing or what's going to happen as a result of, all of the narratives and storylines that are happening. Right. There's just a sense of we're bracing for something that we probably hadn't seen before. And it's difficult to be able to articulate what that actually feels like in DC, because so many people's jobs and responsibilities are uniquely intertwined with what's happening at the highest levels of government. Everybody here, the three of us, are going to be extremely affected one way or the other about what happens in the White House these next couple days. Mm-hmm. Same thing on the Hill. So I just think it's like we're used to it in a weird way. Like
things that to that point. Yeah, we're used from government shutdowns to election season.
Right. This is like since I've been living in DC, like the 12th time where there's been like a halt on everything. It depends on depending on what happens, we could be coming out on the other side of this kind of different. Right. As a society,
I think as a society, we've never been faced with something that shut every corner of the. Because even when the government shuts down, yes, like to your point, Mike, and to your point, or more to Darren, like because the physical nature of this, physical small size of the city, but that intertwinedness that everybody if they don't work in this, they are only 1 degree of separation. There's not 2 or 3. They're one. Their roommate, their brother, their sister, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, husband, wife. Somebody works in this where they're a cog in that larger machine. But so when the government shuts down, it hits us different, or there's major political things that hits us different, and the country knows about it, and it may affect other people. I think this still feels like the first time that maybe since 9/11, and even in 9/11, I was living in DC at the time, and that East Coast bias. When I went back home to Cleveland, they cared. But they weren't like worried like we were here in DC, like, another terrorist attack is going to hit this city or right away. Mm-hmm. So this feels like everybody could get it.
Yeah.
Wish technically they could, but I do understand that point. Like it is hard to articulate when you say feel it in the air, but it's very palpable. Like you come here and it's like, even if you're a guest in DC, the moment you start moving around the city and talking to people, or everybody from the bellman to the bartenders are tapped into a lot of different things like that.
One thing that I think people forgot about, and this is like come up for me thinking about how baseball isn't going to start here, but the Nationals won the World Series.
Very glad they won it when they won it.
And like Trump was there, and he got booed. The president of the United States.
I was there. I literally, I have that. Go back to my Instagram feed. I was there. Very powerful. I was like, why are they booing? Because they didn't show them on the jumbotron immediately, and as soon as they did, you start hearing like a quick crescendo of boos.
I don't think we didn't really understand the cultural impact of that. Like, on one respect, it's a clip similar time of there. If you remember, Barack Obama apparently was in Toronto a few weeks. I don't know if it was around the same time, weeks before. I want to say it was before that. Mm-hmm. But he was in Toronto, and the announcer announces him as, I think it was like Mr. Barack Obama or something like that, or something crazy.
You mean I think he was at a. Was that a basketball game?
It was a basketball game.
Toronto, yes, yes. I remember that. Raptors.
And he was there, and they start, this is another country. They stand and cheer him, and he waves and they do the whole thing, and to me it was just such an interesting contrast to what you had at the World Series. Was just like an outright rejection of the American president in a time where all of this stuff was going on at this point in October, right? We could look at it when we leave this building, and he was roundly booed at what is supposed to be the American pastime,
The pinnacle of Americana.
the pinnacle of Americana. That's an amazing way to put it. And the president's sitting there being booed, and it's like, how do you, as someone who likes history and reads history, and how do you even begin to fathom what that actually means about our culture
and our leadership
and the leadership and the faith that we have in leadership? It was like, this is an impossible thing to begin to wrap your mind around. And I think that what we're seeing coming out of the White House now is a reflection of that, where people just don't have faith that they know what's going on and that they have a handle on how to fix these enormous problems that our society is now faced with.
So let me ask you another thing. Now, as a reporter or a journalist, do you find it hard to have relationships, friendships with people because they think of you as a journalist first and they have to watch what they say to you, as opposed to you're Darren Sands today? Not I'm a journalist, but I'm the person, Darren Sands. I mean, I know sometimes when, not with me, but some people when they hear or meet a journalist, they automatically get a red flag that you gotta watch what you say to them. Do you find that a lot these days, or?
Yeah, I think people are aware of it in terms of not wanting to say something that is going to end up in print, or that they're going to, comment on something that will have been seen as over by the time it gets into print, or they're making, I don't know, you don't want to say something bad about someone, especially here in Washington, D.C., that is going to get you put on a
no one wants the wrong headline and so many things, because so many people work under the name of another person. I.e., whether you work for, say you work for a member of Congress, you work for an agency, even if you work for any one of these agencies or a contractor to those agencies, you're now representing, quote unquote, the president and stuff. One of the reasons why I left my job before I had this one was that when I knew I was starting this, and they were like, well, you can't really talk about Trump or things of that nature because you're working for a quasi-government agency. And it's just like, all right, well, I know that might seem small to you all, but I was like, I can't not sit here and not just even if I talk objectively about it, it's going to sound negative.
Yeah.
But I think something the reason why I have a good relationship with you, because there's plenty of people that we both know that think differently of it, in the sense of don't say the wrong thing around Darren or people who are in the media. But it's like you strike a good balance of being around professionally. We've been at parties and events where you're like, you got to kind of realize when people, who's working and who's there to try to get you, because I still feel like there are reporters who, I'm quoting anybody, anywhere, anytime, and you got to, I think that's the biggest part of trying to figure out who those people are and who those people aren't.
Plus, you also have a gift when you call. It's not a got you kind of situation.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm just calling to find out about it, and one thing leads to another, and that's a lot of reporters or journalists are they're trying to get the next big story, but you can kind of just tell with you is you're genuine, you're trying to really get this story out, and you're not trying to it's not a got you kind of situation and things like that. And then you find that some of us are just open up to you, and next thing you know, you come to talk about one or two things, and we talk about 6 things.
Yeah.
Right there and there. That's that's a gift.
I try to, I appreciate that. I mean, I try to, first just, I like all the people who I end up dealing with most times. Like when I deal with people for stories, or the people who are extremely plugged in and know exactly what's going on and what the
real is.
Yeah, what the real is. Like, if I can get that, which is usually my goal, I feel like I can always work from that. Yeah, I can always work from even if I can't get like the biggest thing in the story or the biggest thing that's happening, if I can work from a ground level of understanding in terms of what the situation is, especially for people who are working on an issue or a set of policy ideas or an agenda, I want to know the truth, even if I can't publish it right away. So just working from there and having an understanding of where the fault lines are in terms of where people won't go or can't go. I've gotten pretty good at like saying, like knowing that and saying, hey, look, I know you can't go on this other thing, but like, can you tell me how you feel about it, or where I should, start poking around? You can't do the gotcha thing.
Because I feel like that gets you that one. It might get you that one.
It might
gotcha.
get you one story, yeah, but it's not gonna serve you
in the long term.
In the long term, I've done that before, where I have had to publish stuff knowing that, I'll probably just burn this person, and it's a rarity, but you kind of have to think about it in terms of, you have to have an ability to have the push and the pull. Like sometimes I have to go hard, and my sources will understand that. Like, look, I can't. This time I just can't like beat around the bush. You know what I'm saying? Like, I need the quote on this thing. And a lot of times, once I have a really good working relationship, people will understand that sometimes I got to throw a fastball like high and hard and and up. And it's not comfortable. And I'm trying to think of a good example because
I know
we're talking in baseball analogies.
No, I think I get what you're saying in the sense of like, and I think that kind of goes into my next question as it relates to political media, and then also I think even hip hop media, they kind of mirror this in the sense that it's becoming more and more mainstream, more and more outlets, both on TV and digital, online. But I think Trump, people have always had a feeling about media in general, but there has definitely been a shift in what newspapers meant to us at one point, when you're talking 100 years, even 50, 60 years ago, of like, hey, these are trusted news sources. The Walter Cronkites is giving America their information. You've got the Chicago Defenders and black newspapers who've been around for 50 to 100 years, who they were trusted pillars of our community because that's how we got news. And then now with the internet and the maturing, like we had the internet for a while, but now the internet's really matured. Social media has matured. The speed of news and the connectivity of the American people, or people in general, has changed. And what the definition of the media, I think, has all shifted. And now we got a guy who's pouring gasoline on, if there were smoldering fires of like, I don't trust what I'm seeing and hearing, he's like, he put gasoline, grease all over it, and is like, talks about it all day, the non-trusting media. So even people who don't follow Trump, he put it in the zeitgeist so much day in and beat us in. So we all kind of are starting to shift that way. So that's kind of the premise that's like, because I think there's a lot that
I agree.
I
with
want
the
to
premise
kind of talk to you uniquely. Like I said, you worked for Buzzfeed, which is like the pinnacle of I think a pinnacle representation of what the new digital media age is, and like a website and a organization that kind of represents that. My first question is, do you feel like there's been a shift, because you've been reporting now for 15 years? 15, 16,
Somewhere
17
in there,
years.
yeah.
So you came in the internet age, but it was the early internet age to
Right.
now, to like fully developed. What are some of your reflections or observations about the nature of the news reporting business as we've gone into this digital social media headline driven kind of space?
Yeah, the biggest thing that I would say is that the speed of it has been something that you had to adjust to, and the technology itself. So when I was in college, I remember having an ethics class where there was a smart guy in that class who was talking about blogs and like wanted to talk about the ethical implications of blogging and how as an emerging part of digital media, what considerations did we need to be taking into consideration, or what did we have to be thinking about from an ethical standpoint as it related to blogs? If we were to write blogs, as we're reading blogs, this is like 03, 04, 05 in that space. And
We had no idea.
I had a really smart ethics journalism professor who's like in his field, he'd written all sorts of books. His the case studies that he had done. He'd really taken a academic and smart but very worldly approach to that type of the type of ethics that reporters need to be worried about and thinking about in all realms. So this not just in the United States, but whether you cover foreign policy, are you covering war, are you covering famine, you're covering whatever. Like, he was the go-to person. And like you said, when it came to blogs, he was just like, dude, I don't know. Like, this is all new to me. And so I think like the speed of it took a lot of people. It made people feel a little bit guarded and like not knowing what to say. I think that now a lot of it is just like we've done the language for ourselves. Like like in so many ways the rules get written and then rewritten, and there's kind of almost like an intrinsic understanding about what those ground rules are in terms of ethically. But I've just tried to always, adhere to like a core set of values. And
What are those? I'm curious. What are your personal reporting values that you try to adhere to?
Equality in terms of racial equality, in terms of the kinds of voices that get to come to the table to have influence on how policy is covered. I talk to a range of people who have a range of experiences. I want to get Black people talking about white issues and white people talking about Black issues.
What's a white issue?
A white
I'm curious
issue,
when you say that.
like a white issue is like you just go like by the states. I mean, I think that Black people should be covering what's going on with farmers and stuff like that. And there's not a lot of Black farmers up there. I mean, but like those are the kinds of things where if you cover a quote unquote white issue for long enough, you'll start to see the way that these different experiences or difficulties that they go through are reflected more broadly in the culture someplace else, especially if it's like some places Black. So like a lot of the issues that farmers deal with, you could bring parallels to sharecropping in the South in the 1910s or whatever it is. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's so many ways to tell those kinds of stories that don't necessarily seem like they have anything to do with each other, but that's how I've tried to approach it. Is like, people talk a lot about this idea that you comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, or something. I said that wrong, but it's something like that.
Oh, is that like a famous thing?
That's like a famous thing in journalism.
Okay, I'm gonna look that up because I like the way that is what news you comfort the afflict.
Yeah, comfort the afflicted
and afflict the comfortable.
Afflict the comfortable. That might not be the
That's
right.
kind of, no, I mean it makes sense.
Yeah,
that's what kind of news does.
Yeah,
it helps those who are in need and who need some kind of hope. And usually people who are comfortable are doing something they don't want people to know about.
Right.
So it afflicts them. Yeah.
And like sometimes you can afflict the comfortable, I find, by saying that these farmers aren't just going through some kind of issue that is unique to them. This is the same thing that, someone quote unquote black had to deal with back in the 20s. And so these, like, who is responsible for the way that these people are being treated? Because it's not their fault. And clearly that there's something else going on here that people aren't paying attention to or paying enough attention to. So when you tell a story and you humanize people, regular people, working people, it can sometimes force the hands of people who are, like we said, comfortable, or who are being complacent about the way that they deal with certain things. So I find that a lot of times you can tell a story by almost comparing and contrasting two seemingly different ideas. But once you do enough reporting and writing to show how these things are connected, you have to have a sort of a historical background, but if you do it right, it becomes something that people have to deal with. It's like a gripping thing. There's tension there, and that usually can make for a good story.
Go. I can tell that you're very passionate about what you do. Who are some of the journalists that influenced you? Who did you look up to, and who do you kind of, mirror, or you kind of follow, do some things that they do? Who influenced you in journalism? Yeah, gotcha.
Sorry. Who influenced me in journalism? Sorry about that, listener. I dropped my mic with that question. No, I think it's a good question, man. It's not necessarily journalists or writers or reporters who, obviously I respect a bunch of them. I think the world of Ta-Nehisi Coates. I think the world of Adam Serwer, like my colleagues in the reporting business, people like Ested Herndon, Adam Harris, Josh Jamerson, like I'm I go on in just terms of just like Tia Mitchell, AJC, recent transplant from Atlanta to Washington. Yamiche Alcindor, like a bracing, gripping question to Donald Trump that changed the trajectory of this story.
He dismisses her so much. You see in his face, like he does
He's
not
like,
want
yeah.
to.
He's
He
like,
does
yeah,
not want to answer her questions.
Honestly,
but I love that. I love that she does
look. Say what you want about Donald Trump, he still calls on her.
Yeah.
He likes I guarantee you, he likes the fact that she doesn't back down. She's not afraid. The question is going to be well thought out and well said. There's a wrong way to ask the right question. She crafted that question the right way. There's just so many people who like influence me, but I think those are the people who I just like respect and I feel fortunate that I'm able to kind of just be doing this at the same time as them. So that, I mean, there's so many reporters I could talk all day about, and talk about their work a lot, but it is a fascinating time to also be a journalist, a black journalist especially. It's just a lot to cover.
I think you just kind of really went in. You gave some great examples of some great journalists that inspire you, or you're looking to, and then previous to that, just talking about like the depth of these stories. It seems, as a person who kind of who works in the space from the pitching stories angles, it seems that more and more your writings are going to waste. Like the real thing that people are looking at is headlines. Maybe the first paragraph, that first graph of like, is it capture me? There are fewer and fewer people reading, just in general. Like all the stats show that, just in terms of like how long people are page screens, views, at least digital stats. Newspapers are dying. Like, what do you? Is all that is as much of the essence of the story still as important as like making sure I get something that, like a headline that people even to get them to the story? Like, have you shifted? Like, is that where the news media is going? Like, or is that where you as a reporter are going? It's like, man, I can have the best story in the world, and hopefully it'll go. But if I don't get this hot headline or a hot picture or a hot headline subline that people can easily tweet or something like that, or hashtag meme and things of that nature, like to hook people, it's like, I'm curious to how you look at that. Because, like, again, coming from your experience, both now, your experience, like I said, at Buzzfeed, which I feel like helped drive some of that culture of, like, the headline culture. Like, what are your feelings on that?
I think it's one of my best skill sets from an asset standpoint is just an ability to report and write a story in a way that I know is going to get attention. And so usually
And still be truthful?
And still be truthful. So there's a million ways to do a story about a fallen politician, let's say. But how do you do it? And to my mind, when what are people asking me? Because as someone who's quote unquote in the know, what happened? Right? And I could frame a story. I can call 20 people that might know what's going on. If it's one word from each of them, I gotta figure out a way to put that thing together to tell you what happened, and tell you what I know and what I don't know, what people are saying, what they're not saying, what happened, what was my experience with the dynamic of telling you or trying to figure out this individual or this person. If I know a lot, what can I impart that's going to illuminate and give voice to this idea where people are trying to figure out what happened, what went wrong with an individual. If I can get to the heart of what people are thinking about what they don't know and what they're struggling with, if I can answer that question with the reporting, that's what I want to do. And it requires, I think, you to be in tune with the kinds of people that you're talking to and the kinds of work that people are doing in politics and what they really care about. And knowing as a reporter how the people who are really plugged in even are confused and disconnected and not knowing. If I can help people who are like the consultant class in politics and the church ladies, be interested in a story, I feel like that's
getting
where
those two to mix is tough.
Yeah, well,
the framing, like you're explaining, like, but you write that way, and like getting something that the consulting class and the people in the know,
Yeah.
but the average
Yeah.
Joe in America who's just reading this and
Right.
has no connection to any context of this. They just need to get this from this story.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think that's what everyone's always trying to figure out.
Yes, and the subject matter I think is important because I'll try to go after the subject matter that I know people will be drawn to in that way. Like, so it has to, you got to talk to some of those people. So it's like, kind of, what are you looking for? Like, what do you think is the thing here? And then trying as best as I can with the resources that are at my disposal to, give them that thing that they're looking for. So, and there's ways to do all that stuff that don't feel icky, but like we do want those page views. Like if a journalist is telling you that they don't want a bunch of people, like as many people as possible to read their piece, then they're lying. But
why are you writing? If that's
yeah, you know what I'm saying? So it's tricky, but it's important to be able to figure out.
Did you have one last one before we get into the main question?
What's the hardest part of your job?
The hardest part, one of the hardest parts that I consistently have to deal with is a lot of the topics that I'm trying to tackle are difficult and require an ability to put people at ease in terms of the things that they're getting ready to tell me. Like I'm sure that when we turn these mics off, y'all are both gonna know something that you're gonna like. If I ask you, if I ply you with enough alcohol or something like that, you're gonna be like, yo, this is not go. You know what I'm saying? Like we all have that info living in DC, and same with me. Like I know stuff that I would tell y'all right now. Y'all be like, yo, what? So it's just like the hardest part is getting people to tell me that stuff, knowing that I have to tell them that I might not be able to do anything with it. You know what I'm saying? So,
you mean like people who they got a great, I'm like, I'm ready to drop this. I'm like, here, let me go to Darren, text him, and you're like, thanks, but I don't know if I can actually turn that into a story
like if my
report.
editor is not going to be interested, it's like, well,
But what's kind of funny about that now is if you don't use it, they can run to Facebook or something like that.
right. Or they can do it on their own podcast or something like that. There's so it's like the level that I'm at and the people that I'm talking to, a lot of times they want to know exactly how that thing is going to be presented or the framing or who, like the idea of who it came from. In terms of like anonymous sourcing, I can deal with that sometimes, but not all the time.
That's the main that's the last question before we get into our closing question. Can you sourcing? This is something I think a lot of people have confusion on. They see like, anonymous sources. Trump is like turned that into like he's demonized the concept. Obviously, sources have been used since the beginning of journalism. What is the process when you read sources or anonymous sources and people don't put their names on? Can you explain why that still can be trusted information? If I read something comes from a source, because most people say, well, if they didn't put their name on it, I'm not going to put as much credence or believe it, or that person was too chicken shit to like say who there was. Explain why people you use sources or anonymous sourcing, and if people see that, should they still be believing that? Is it still applicable? Is it still like factual information that they're getting?
Yeah, we usually use anonymous sourcing to advance a story or news that is sensitive enough in nature that the people or person who has the information doesn't have to be, have their name put in a story, and that the individual is protected in the event that that story or bombshell or piece of news becomes bigger in terms of the impact. So let's say there was a member of Congress who was going to be leaving office, announcing their resignation or retirement or whatever this coming week. And I find that out in a text message, and that person the reason why they can't give me the information, I will write in the story. Like, the individual spoke on the condition of anonymity because either they weren't authorized or they were privy to a set of they were privy to information that wasn't readily available or couldn't be publicized in a certain. There are all sorts of different reasons why sources can't reveal that they are the ones who are connected to the news, but I usually try to get as precise I try to use as much precise language as possible in terms of telling you as the reader who the person is or the nature of the work that they do as much as I can. And it's tricky. It's like case by case, but it's something that you learn to exercise as almost like a muscle once you I've been doing it as long as I have. And like, I think one benefit that I have is that the subject matter that I've covered, especially inside Democratic politics and in other areas, has given me like a lot of credibility because I haven't really deviated that far off of the subject matter, and I've sort of become known as a little bit of an authority. So I feel a sense of authority, and like I feel that I'm someone who's able to like speak on this stuff, and so that I am a little bit more forceful in my use of anonymous sources, because I think by now people trust my byline and me enough to know that
even if I don't know who the source is, I understand this was
that,
properly
yeah,
sourced, and this was
right.
real information.
Yeah, this individual is talking to these kinds of people all the time, and you never want to use an anonymous source that like isn't helping you to advance the story. But a lot of times, like,
oh, so you're using that as like a last, like,
yeah,
anonymous sources are like I was not saying best case scenario, last scenario. It's like as a last resort.
Yeah, a lot of times it's a last resort. Sometimes I'll use an anonymous source or two to like back up reporting that I already have, and just talk about. I'm trying to think of a good example, but maybe a good example is like from the member of Congress thing. Like, if I figure out from a source that a member of Congress is retiring or is, something involving them that is newsworthy, I will use more information toward the bottom of the story to give the reader background and give the reader a sense of backstory in terms of what's going on here. So it's like two sources told me that one of the things that the member had to deal with a lot last year was the, loss of a important fundraiser or whatever. Like, I want to give context and breadth to the news items, and a lot of times, sometimes that requires that I ask people for more information that might not be readily available, or that I might not be able to verify in 30 minutes or whatever, and I just need to publish. And if I can get those two sources, or maybe even more than that sometimes, to just give me a little bit, I feel better about the context and the stuff that I can add to bring people to a better understanding of what's actually going on.
Man, we could see there's just, obviously I'm a fan of the media, of like the media space, the communication space. Like I feel like I could talk to you for hours just about these general topics without even, let alone, like you said, there's plenty of stuff that we could talk about off the air that's like, oh, do you know this? Like, in addition to getting just tea and so forth. But so I'm saying that to say that you're gonna have to come back at some point.
I'm happy
Yes, as we get as we move more toward and get back to the social distancing piece ends, and we get back to more, because we're planning some more live podcasts and some more live events and stuff like that. And I think because the media, more than anything, especially with social media now blending into that, and digital media, and what we're doing right here, podcasting with a little video element as well to it, is so intriguing to people, because it feels like, oh, it's achievable. Like I can go on my phone, I can go on social media, I can go on internet. Like TV used to be so much harder to get to. Like as a person, if I watch TV, almost everybody at some point probably wanted to be on TV in some capacity, whether they're news, TV performer, actor, something. People love being and seeing on TV, but it's just a harder medium to crack. Now the internet and news and so forth has all merged together. Like I started hip politics because I'm like, well, I've worked in this space, and once you start adding up what it takes to get into it, it's like, I can get into it. Now to be good at it, it takes a whole nother level, but you can get into it. So I just think it intrigues so many people. So you being at a space and a place that's kind of saw what the end of yesteryear was to what it is now, to even your next journey and your next, like what your next steps are, how that's going to be probably something that we haven't truly seen in the exact form.
Yeah.
Like we're kind of making a lot of these things up, and it's evolving so rapidly. So I just think that I want us to have, like, you as a journalist and a few other like really good digital journalists in this day and age can uniquely speak about the things that are at the core of what our platform is about. So it's like, yeah, we'd love to have you back.
Yeah.
Yeah. In one shape or form. And then obviously this being 2020, people who, I think reporters have a very unique perspective. I know you guys have to a lot of time report the news, even though now news has started to become more editorialized and opinionated. Most people think all news is opinionated, but just your observations and how many people you do get to talk to, how many places you do get to go, I think is very, very unique.
It's what you're talking about, and I'm happy to come on anytime, but like I think in particular J. Cole has like articulated this to my mind in a way that is important. And like with that song Middle Child, it's so interesting because a lot of people love that song, and that song took off as a single, where Cole is someone who like has had trouble like trying to like score singles, trying to like make a hit. He talked about just like not having that gene or that that bone that's just like an instant hit, and he still had so much commercial success. But with Middle Child, it's interesting that he talks about that line is like, I'm dead in the middle of two generations. I'm like, little bro and big ball all at once, right?
Yeah, I know exactly that line.
And it's like what he's talking about is the ability to synthesize the demands and ideas and the urgings of that older generation, learning from them, interpreting what they did in his own career, and also being able to like reach out down to like other younger people, younger rappers. And there have only been so many generations like that in the course of modern American history. But I think that the quote unquote middle child does have that that ability and that responsibility to be speaking to
up and down
and across and like all different places. And I think like we don't think of it. I think hip hop culture in particular allows us to do that if we're being fluent culturally in a mainstream culture where we're seen as the purveyors and like the owners in so many different ways. We have a important responsibility to make sure that the kind of equality and inclusion that the culture represents is actually seen in politics, and that the voices are highlighted and seen as important as anyone's voice, and so I'm appreciative for the opportunity to get to do it with y'all.
He says, I'm dead in the middle of two generations.
Yeah.
No, I think that's kind of it. It was what my value proposition to hip politics, in the sense that my favorite rapper turned 50 in December, Jay-Z. And he just dropped his affectionally Watch the Throne 2 with Jay Electronica
Right.
being all over that joint. So still, obviously, super in the culture. But then you got NBA YoungBoy, the number one streaming artist, or number one top 2 or 3 streaming hip hop artists on YouTube from Louisiana, is 19, talking reckless, but they are both in a culture and then you got Ice-T, who's on TV, I think 63, 64, had one of the original protest, Cop Killer, and one of some of these original protest songs, and has gone so many places. And so their age range, but there's stuff Ice-T and NLE Chopper with 40 plus years in between them. There's a essence that they connect to. There's a language they both can kind of understand. Like there's a spirit of like not caring or being a disruptor, a little bit of that fuck it attitude, like that defiance. Like there's so many things that those two people can connect to just through the hip hop as that medium and as that cultural generation. So setting that up, we end every show asking all our guests and getting them on the record. This will be quoted. This is on the record. Here we go. Who, top 5 dead or alive? Who are your top 5 dead or alive? Let's know. And that's favorite hip hop artists. And as Mike is giving me the look, the caveat is that if you say a group, you can't say a group as one person. Or you can't say Wu-Tang, you can't say Outkast. Well,
You can't say Andre 3000 without saying
yeah, you can't say
So one of mine is
I don't agree with that.
One of mine.
This is
wouldn't be if we wasn't with
but then to his, I always counter. I'm like, I could say Method Man, and Method Man wouldn't be who he was if he wasn't with Wu-Tang, but he's had enough of his own career to be his own man. And just the same, I say the same thing about, especially with Big Boy. Big Boy has had a whole.
That's one of my artists falls directly into that category.
So you go your way, and let's see how that works out. Who's your top 5?
So the artist that falls into that category in my top 5 is Jadakiss.
He just dropped Ignatius.
Which I got to sit with the album more to give a real to tell you what I think about it. But he's somebody who's just been like so consistent and is always like he's always into the lyricism and talks about the impact of the lyricism and the craft of it and where it's going now and what that means. Like he's I think he, in terms of like people who talk like a lot about the lyricism in hip hop, like he might be the person who is like most representative of the last 20 years in hip hop. And just in his ability to stay like
super relevant.
Like
you hear it in his interviews, and like I think it also helps that he doesn't look old per se. Like he has a look, so he's always had the baby face look, I think, but he's always sounded mature. So when he first came out, he was 17, 19. I feel like he sounded, at least voice, tone, texture, very similar to how he sounds now. He has to be well over 40 something. And yeah, I feel you. His lyrics have always been there. He's had some club bangers. I mean, he's part of one of the most legendary groups, both with Locks, his Bad Boy affiliation, Rough Riders.
Yep.
He's on some of the best songs and brought out. You get no.
He's one of the people.
He put out an album called Top 5 Dead or Alive.
He's one of the people who put like real bars and like off on Pharrell beats, and that it was popping anywhere you went, and that's still the case. I just feel like his voice is so crazy as a rapper. I mean, he's probably got one of the best voices, period. But just like, I don't know, man. He's super tough to me.
So you got Jada.
I got Jadakiss. I got Kanye. Just in terms
As
of
a rapper,
in terms of its impact on the culture, I think I look at cultural impact as being very significant in my analysis, and everybody doesn't think like that, but just in terms of what he was able to do with the albums, with the collaborations, the way that he reinvigorates Jay-Z's career in 2001, 2002 is something that people don't necessarily always talk about. But that sound that Kanye brought to Hove, to so many people at that one period of time, especially after 9/11, like hip hop was able to stay so relevant after 9/11 in a lot of ways because of Kanye's emergence. And I was there, right? Like I remember seeing him perform in colleges, like with John Legend and stuff like that.
I went back to Howard and the song. He got booed. He got booed.
Really?
He got booed. This is Blueprint came out. But his what's it called? Or am I just forgetting his song with Jamie Foxx? It hadn't come out yet.
But he performed it.
It was before. It was actually before him Through the Wire. It was before he had this car accident, but he still had a mixtape out.
Yeah.
And I had already graduated, but I went back to school. Like I was only 21, 22. So I went back it was like a homecoming performance. He got, like Kanye went through it, and for him to transition, he's been as a producer, as a cultural icon, as fashion, as rap. Like, I think one other part about why because I go on the fence because he doesn't write all his own raps and stuff. It's like, how is he in my top 5 as a rapper? But I think the concept of unabashedly having ghostwriters and like having like he leaned into it in the sense like, yeah, I write my own raps, but other people write stuff for me. But what you get is like the best song ever. So do you want the best song ever, or do you just want me to try to figure this one little part out? And then you got Ye.
Yeah.
His new stuff.
Yeah. And then for me, Cole is in my top 5.
Okay.
His worldview, I think, is one of the most impactful ways that an artist has created a fan base and a following. And being that he's kind of from the heartbeat of American militarism, being from Fayetteville, North Carolina, and the way that Fayetteville was impacted by Vietnam, impacted by American foreign policy, the way that Fayetteville just changed culturally because of Vietnam and because of war, this idea of endless war, and him being a child of that in so many different ways, and being able to articulate a humanistic, a humanitarian someone who's like focused on healing, someone who's focused on like talking about the ways that people live through pain. And I just think that his ability to give voice to all of that stuff is like similar to the way Kanye came in, right? Like wanting to be a rapper really, really, really bad, and then understanding that the impact required that he just do more than that. It's just been, it's incredible to see his growth from like Friday Night Lights and all that stuff to where he is now. You could say what you want about the bars and all, you know, people like to argue about his lyricism and whether he's really nice and all that stuff, but I just think that he was coming in with so many kind of, you know, what you would think as deficiencies as a rapper. You know what I'm saying? Like, he's lanky on stage. He like, at first he was a little bit awkward. You know what I'm saying? He like even talks about that, and sometimes in interviews, like he would look at himself and be like, all right, what am I doing? You know what I'm saying? And it's just like, there were so many different like times where he could have been like, I ain't doing this ain't for me, and actually making it and just where the game was and what was being required of him. I think he's just his cultural impact is just, you know, limitless. So I think about Cole a lot, and the other ones is obviously Hove. I think I could, you know, what more can you?
What can I say?
Right. Yeah, I think
to me, he's the archetype. He is. I mean, there's people who come before him and people come after him, but
yeah,
if you check off any and everything that you talk about the culture and what you want to look in the beginning, middle, end, and continuing forward.
Yeah,
he's the model to me.
And to me, the person who I think about in all of this analysis, like it begins with me for Tupac.
So he's your fifth.
He's my guy. I just think the way that we think about rappers and the way that like Kanye talks about how we the new rock stars, like that is real. And the idea that like black men, black women, rappers, hip hop artists, whatever you want to call it, are leading the culture, are leading a global culture. You know what I'm saying? Like, Ari Lennox is a singer from like this area, DC, DMV. She has like 1 album, 1.5 albums, 2 albums.
That Shape of the Baby goes though.
But I mean,
that joint
it's
goes.
bizarre how good that album is. But I'm just saying, like, she's in New Zealand and in Australia, like singing to packed houses. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? So that's like, to me, begins in so many ways with Tupac, and just his ability to be so, he was so expressive and passionate almost all the time. And people forget how much that passion impacted people, especially in the culture. People like Jada Pinkett, like he was in movies. Tupac was a extremely famous person who like came from being like a rapper. And I think a lot of it is like this, you know, a lot of his legacy is that Mamba mentality thing where someone dies, they become immortalized, and it's like their presence in the culture becomes more prevalent, and just the immortalization of an individual like that impacts the culture in ways that we don't even understand. And I just think that Pac made so much space for people in hip hop because he was complex. And like hip hop is really about complexity. You know what I'm saying? Whether it's in the lyrics or if it's in like the idea that one of the best lyricists, rappers ever, probably the best ever, is like somebody like Eminem. And he's a white dude who like is from Detroit. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's hip hop is like used to the idea that as human beings we can be extraordinarily complex and still have something to offer to the entire human race, not just for the people that's in our hood, you know. And I would say too, just to end it, it's like, did you see that? Y'all see that Muhammad Ali documentary, that the doc that LeBron produced?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw it from when I worked at the museum. Like, cause he and his guy Maverick, they're the ones who donated the money for that.
Okay.
For that the Muhammad Ali section.
Yeah.
They put that money up there, and then so when it came out, they debuted it. They like did a screening there, so I got to see it. Yeah. Really
One of the things that I hadn't thought about with that is just the way that Muhammad Ali was a lyricist. He was like, his presentation was musical. And where does that come from? To me, that came from like the church. That comes from the music. That comes from everything. So he's his own person. He's an individual talking junk in the ring. The idea that you would talk shit, you know, like when you're about to fight somebody or after you just fought somebody, was a completely foreign concept back in those days when people like Jack Johnson and Joe Louis, those boxers were, you know, gentlemen to the larger culture who were dangerous in the fact that they could beat up another fighter. But other than that, they were seen as members of high society and people who had to really be worried about how their image was cast in the larger culture. And Ali, I think, just it made me realize how much of his presentation was just about lyricism and the content of what the words that you say. And Malcolm X, same thing. So I think just that cultural aspect is what Pac represented. He's always talking forcefully about and passionately about something, whether it was his voice or elsewhere. And to me, Pac is the kind of the quintessential artist where you're not just you're not just a rapper. You could be anything when you have
anything,
that kind of.
You can be anything. You can rap about anything.
Yeah.
He made every subject a hit. He's one of the, I think, the first person, not the first, because I would say I'd had to maybe give it to either Ice-T, maybe broke in a little bit before him, a few years before, but he kicked down, and Ice Cube was around the same time getting his first 1 or 2 roles.
Yeah.
But he kicked down mainstream TV doors of like, yo, I'm doing all these movies. Like, to me, when I look at Tupac, you know who I get like the direct lineage of some of that? DMX. I look at like a very complex person who has had a lot of very hits, very passionate, and he kicked down like, yo, while I'm hot and while I'm out here, I'm in all these movies. I'm in all these movies, and I'm putting out albums that are impactful. But to your point, I give you that. Like you said, all the people you mentioned are, like you said, to that point, are extremely culturally important as rappers, as hip hop artists.
We global, man.
We are.
Thanks to those folks.
Well, this is one of our longer episodes, but I didn't really notice it at first, and then I just looked down. I was like, oh shit.
Sorry.
But this is that's the good part about being fully independent. Do what it want. And putting it all up there. It's out there for the people. Putting this out there for the people. Again, thank you for sharing. Like I said, thanks for working with us both individually over time. I don't know if you're going to do it again, but I still remember the legendary house party from 2016 in Philly.
What house party?
You weren't there. It was the Philly Democratic. This is as far as it goes. Philly Democratic National Convention.
Yeah.
There was a house party.
I did a house party at the DNC that was pretty legendary. Now that I think about it.
The kind of people who were there.
The people that were there was crazy compared
to who they are then, but more so who they are.
Who they are now. Yeah.
And like what we're looking forward to. I'm gonna definitely talk to you offline because we're gonna be on Radio Row. That's what pushing for, but I haven't figured out what we want to do. But we need to make sure we bring some outside of the main thing. We need a certain type of energy like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially around this. But no, man, I just appreciate the work you're doing. I appreciate you sharing with us, like sharing your story, your insights. I learned some things. I think great conversation. I think people are going to learn some things. That's even more so. Keeping up the good work. Really looking forward to your next moves. I think we got you in a perfect time. So now that you're unshackled from one, before you get shackled by another, like in that in between space, dope top 5, dope, very insightful thought about that as well. So Darren, just want to say thank you. And did you want to just drop any of your socials or how people can find your work?
Yeah, sure. Just Darren Sands, DARREN Sands SANDS on Twitter, and keep up with me, guys. I appreciate the opportunity.
No, all right. Make sure you check us out. All our socials everywhere, but it's Hip Politics Podcast. The merch is out. We haven't put the merchandise, the new gear. We got some sweatshirts and T-shirts are out. Haven't put the pause on the big promotional push, but you'll start seeing it more and more. Due to just what's going on in the world, it just feels like no one's paying attention to that, and or also people's money's about to be fucked up. So a lot of people. So just trying to be sensitive to that. But if you want to support, you can do that. Patreon page is launching very, very soon. Subscribe on YouTube for the video. Hip Politics, you just look up Hip Politics Podcast on all platforms: iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and more, in Google Podcasts. We are out here. Mike, you got anything you want to make sure you find me at Mr. Cameron Calvin, MrCameron Calvin on Twitter and Instagram, and then Hip Politics and the Hip Politics Podcast pages on Facebook. So we're all over the place. You type in Hip Politics, one of our platforms or one of our streams is coming up. Mike, anything?
When's this going up?
I don't know.
Everybody out there be safe and
it's coming out. We're in Corona still. Right. We're no matter when this comes out. Moving forward, this will be. We're still in the throes of Corona. If anything, it has probably evolved. Hopefully, the zombies have not started to come back from the dead. That's what it's. As a Walking Dead fan, it's like, is this how this started? it just is. Not all seriousness. Be safe. Continue to be safe and vigilant. Like, this is something we will clearly get past and be over. Just don't panic and overreact. Thank you again for listening to us.
It's the month of March. I want to give my mother. It's her birthday this month, March 28th. Happy birthday, Mom.
Okay. Oh, happy birthday.
Yeah.
For
Mama
sure.
McQuarrie. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. We've been growing and steadily growing, so we appreciate all the support. Thanks for listening to this long but insightful conversation. Tell a friend. Tell a coworker. We're almost there. So with that, we are out. The Hip Politics Podcast. Peace.
Hip Politics, baby.
Shorty, you the no filter. IG pic, no filter. You could get the